and welcome to Scientific and Technical Communication. My name is Richard Ward, and I'll be your instructor today. Today we're going to be discussing persuading your audience specifically. By the end of this module, it is my hope that we will be able to define persuasion in claims, determine your persuasive approach, anticipate how your audience may react, choose a strategy to connect with your audience, respect various limitations when making an argument, support your argument using evidence and reason, understand how social media influences persuasion, and prepare a convincing argument. So what is persuasion? Persuasion, typically it means trying to influence somebody's actions, opinions, or decisions. In the workplace, we are going to be relying on persuasion daily. So you may be looking for money for certain projects. You may be looking for certain actions for the company to take in order to make things move a little bit easier, and what have you. Persuasion is going to be based on the rhetorical principles. And listen, I know you're going to hear a lot of people who will say that technical communication is devoid of rhetoric, or that it has no persuasion, that even within scientific and technical documents such as research projects, there's no persuasion. There's no movement for rhetoric in there. But that's just not true. In fact, we wouldn't read these types of documents if we weren't interested, if there wasn't some drive, if there wasn't some pull. And if we start reading these documents and they turn out to be a little too dry or disinteresting, we'll put them down. So they do have to be rhetorical in nature, okay? And just to reiterate, while there are many different forms of rhetorical approaches, the three main ones that people typically focus in on are going to be ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, dealing more with credibility and logic. Pathos is going to be the more pathetic appeal, this emotional approach, and it can be argued that pathos is still going to be found in many of your scientific documents, in all of your scientific documents, in order for you to help pull you into it, and logos being the more logical appeal. Now, there are other appeals such as doxa and so on, but we won't get into those specifically. So what we're going to be talking about, let's talk a little bit more about persuasion specifically. So almost all workplace documents are going to have some kind of implicit or explicit persuasive goal. So implicit persuasion, and this is going to be the persuasion that you're going to find within documents such as scientific studies, research, and things of that nature. And this is going to assure the readers that the information provided is accurate. It's going to fall within that realm of logos, and that the facts are correct, and that the writer is fluent, competent, and knowledgeable. And that while it can be said that fluency, competency, and knowledge can be looked at as reflecting the ethos or the credibility of the person giving the instruction or providing this information, it also has to be stated that this cannot operate without the effect of pathos, because fluency, competency, and knowledgeability are all going to affect how we feel about that document, whether or not we take it seriously, whether or not we put it down, and it may drive us to have certain emotions, certain feelings about whatever that information is. One only need to look back during when Pluto was taken from planetary status and, dwarf planet, proto kind of place that it's in now. when that information came out, the information was relegated in a very clinical way, but there was a lot of emotion that transpired during the findings of, or the descriptions of moving Pluto from planet to dwarf planet status. So the pathetic appeal is often inescapable. And then you have explicit persuasion, and this is just blatant seeking outright to win readers over to a particular point of view about some specific issue that is in some way controversial, asking for money from the department. This is a very general notion of how controversial can be. Yes, they may not wish to give you money, and it's controversial in that you're asking to have that money, but it's still explicit that you are coming out and asking for it specifically. Now, before you undertake any writing as a persuasive document, you need to first consider what you want to do, how you want to accomplish this, and you got to realize that goals are going to overlap often. Do you want to A, influence people's opinions, or B, enlist people's support, or C, submit a proposal, or D, change people's behavior? All of these things should be considered, and you need to understand what specifically you're looking to do, right? Influencing people's opinions may run hand in hand with changing people's behaviors or the submission of that proposal. Is it a good time for submitting that proposal? And so on. You also want to try to predict the audience's reaction within your document. So any document can evoke different reactions depending on the reader's temperament, interests, fears, biases, ambitions, or assumptions. You have to understand that whenever a person's views are going to be challenged, and you've seen this very recently within a lot of the political stuff that's going on, anytime that people have their views challenged, they're going to react with some defensive questions such as says who, or so what, or why should I, or what's in this for me, or what will it cost, or what are the risks. All of these things are these are very logical questions to ask whenever a view is challenged, but you are also getting what we call self-sealing beliefs, where often it doesn't matter how you answer these. People are going to find a way to go around, especially conspiracy theorists are going to go around and find a way to seal that and say, well, that's just what they want you to think. So there's this kind of like never-ending loop of information that's being provided and a never-ending unacceptance from that party to accept what you have to bring to the table. But for logical purposes and within technical documents, you need to make sure that you're asking these questions when you go out and you start to write your document. All right? Says who, so what, why should I, as in why should they care or why should they believe it? What's in this for them? What will it cost, and what are the risks? So getting people to admit that you might be right means getting them to admit that they might be wrong. And that's tough for a lot of people to swallow. Audiences will accept an argument for any of three reasons, okay? One is going to be compliance. This is going to be acceptance under pressure. This is going to be acceptance that you are told to accept. The ways that a specific department runs a specific program within that department, or the way that that department exercises any form of operating procedure or something of that nature. That may be some kind of a forced compliance that you have to accept under pressure, meaning that there is a consequence to not performing it. Unacceptance by the group or loss of job, any of that kind of stuff. Another way that people will accept an argument is going to be through identification, and this is going to be acceptance for personal reasons. Acceptance for personal reasons means that they can see certain reasons for why that could be a valuable argument, but they're very superficial. They don't hit the underlying person's ideology. They're just accepting it based on the group may accept it, and therefore they're going to accept it because they want to maintain certain personal relationships and connections and what have you. The best way an audience can accept an argument is going to be through internalization, and this is going to be an acceptance based on an argument making good sense. Internalization is where they have seen that argument, they have thought about that argument, and they internalize it as part of their own thought processes within it. This can be a difficult thing to manage, and pounding home those specific points and asking yourself those questions that we talked about previously are going to be a very important step in trying to help someone internalize why a specific argument is going to be accepted. 3 ways of connecting with an audience. You're going to find that there is this power connection, this relationship connection, and this rational connection. Power connection is going to order readers to kind of show up. This is mandatory meetings, things that are going to have people come there and just, they have to be there. Then you have that relationship connection, and that's going to be inviting readers to participate more. And it leaves specific choices to the reader. They can come, they don't have to come, and it makes it feel like it's a part of them a little bit more. And then lastly is the rational connection, and that's going to present authoritative evidence. And this is one of the more concrete ways of connecting. This is going to be offering alternatives, it's going to offer compromise, and it also leaves choices to the readers. But not only that, it's also going to offer incentives to keep the reader engaged and to help and to accept certain specific things. So you want to make sure that you are allowing for any give and take. You want to make a balanced argument. Both sides of the issue have to be considered evenly and fairly. So if you are asking for money, you specifically want to talk about, the pros and cons of getting and not getting that money, especially if you're talking about building a bridge for a specific area. Yes, it's going to be a little bit more costly. However, this bridge is going to be much safer over the previous design. You also want to invite people to find weak spots in your case and to maybe improve upon it. This can be done through questioning the audience, asking for questions and asking for feedback. And do not be afraid to not have the answers, okay, when you're asking these questions. These questions are going to be not just for their help, but to help you as well, and to help kind of like nail down exactly what you're trying to look for. And it'll make your overall argument a little bit more powerful and a little bit more concrete. You want to invite people to challenge your ideas. You want people to come along and say, I don't think I can get behind this because. And then that gives you a stepping stone on how to go in and further that argument. When others offer an opposing view, you need to do certain things, okay? First, you need to try to see the issue from their way instead of just insisting on your way, okay? There was an old philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer, who believed in the fusion of horizons, where people would tend to sit down at a table to argue a point, and it's not necessarily about making one side be the right side, okay? It was just a matter of bringing 2 people to a table, letting them state outright what their problems are, and then walking away with this fusion of understanding that even though you may not have been persuaded to change, the concept has broadened within your mind to accept a bigger and broader audience. So I would suggest that you sit and you listen rhetorically and listen and try to hear their side of the issue. Then you want to make sure that you rephrase an opposing position in your own words so that you are sure you understand it accurately, okay? If you go and you repeat this back to them and they say, no, not exactly, then obviously there is a disconnect and you need to make sure that you're connecting this as solidly as possible. Then you want to try reaching agreements on what you can do next, on ways that you can resolve any insurmountable differences that you all may have. You also want to explore possible compromises that others might accept. It may not necessarily be wholly what you want. but it could be something that both sides might benefit. Don't be afraid to ask for what you want when making an argument, okay? Let people know what you want them to do or think. Don't leave it up to interpretation. Now, in many cultures, this can be a way of moving along a specific route, that it could even be considered dishonorable to come along and state out explicitly what you're asking for. But in American culture and in modern business and science and technical culture, what we look for is to be specific and get right to the point. However, you need to remember that a request that exceeds its audience latitude of acceptance is doomed to fail, period. Okay, if it is something that you're asking for that the audience is just unable to make happen, perhaps too much money that they don't have, or a means of changing something when they don't have an available idea or understanding into the process of how it is understood, that's beyond the latitude of acceptance for that audience. So you need to make sure that you understand that. You need to make sure that you also recognize all constraints. Constraints are limits or restrictions imposed by the situation when you make an argument, okay? Certain constraints can be things like organizational constraints, and these are constraints that are based on company rules. And then you have legal constraints, and these are based on law. Ethical constraints, and these are based on honesty and fair play. Notice how legal constraints and ethical constraints are two individual points, okay? Legal constraints aren't always ethical, and ethical constraints aren't always legal. Case in point, when you had issues happening up with banks, certain banks, and going out and building fraudulent accounts based on certain names for their for customers, and customers were having suddenly multiple accounts in their name opened up and they didn't have any ideas about it, okay? And then you had these whistleblowers come along. Legally, you would think that that the ethical and legal constraints would, coalesce into this and say you can't fire somebody for going and doing what the right thing was. However, that isn't what happened, okay? You had these whistleblowers who came forward and said what was happening, brought this to light, and there was no legal constraints against certain companies from firing them, and they were terminated often, which is a very sad thing, people being fired for doing the right thing. So legal constraints and ethical constraints are individual, and it's a sad thing. Another example can be seen with the Challenger explosion, and I'm sure that many of you have read where certain engineers came along and said, hey, we do not believe that this launch should take place because of the ways that weather conditions affect those O-rings. And people were pressured into going ahead anyway, and instead of standing up, which could have led to their firing, their termination, or blacklisting within the industry of aeronautics, space and aeronautics, it could have saved lives, but then we would have never known the disaster would have happened, and they would have been blacklisted. However, now we look back with hindsight and say, well, somebody should have said something. And that's legal constraints and ethical constraints are very precarious instances, and you have to navigate them very carefully. Other constraints are going to be like time constraints, and these are going to be based on your timing and when you can deploy these certain things. If you're asking for money for specific bridge construction and things like that, make sure that you're asking at opportune times and not when the city or the town or the people that you work for are in a specific it might not be a good time to bring up your new bridge idea to the engineering company that you work for that is currently going through a restructuring phase. So consider certain constraints on when to drop this stuff. And then you have social and psychological constraints, and this is going to be based on your audience. Furthermore, you don't want to go along and start discussing new building models based on what you want to happen directly after the 9/11 incident. These things, there's a psychological constraint there. You need to consider what's going on, what are people thinking, what's in their heads before I go and deploy what I want to have happen. All right, so you need to make sure that you're also supporting your claims convincingly. The most persuasive argument will be the one that presents the strongest case from the audience's perspective. So you must offer convincing evidence, okay? This evidence must have quality, use credible sources, and be reasonable, okay? Don't just take sources from, and this is why we often, harp on the don't use Wikipedia straight out of pocket for your source material. And the reason why is we tend to believe doctors or scientists or researchers within a specific field more so than we do Smackbot 99 who went and made the comments or whatever in that. So credible sources is very important, and making sure that you have a quality material. Quality evidence is also going to be, you don't want to use evidence that may have been issues with the ways that certain procedures were implemented, and things of that nature. You also want to make sure that you're reasonable. Don't use evidence that's too far out there. You want to make sure that you are using reasonable evidence that proves the point without going too far or going into things that the audience may not necessarily need. Okay? Types of evidence that you can use are like factual statements, statistic examples, other examples, expert testimony, things of that nature. But be careful with expert testimony and things of that nature, that you are using also other forms of evidence that can then back that testimony up so that it's not just hearsay. And next, you want to make sure that you are going to appeal to common goals and values. So consider what the audience also wants to accomplish and how they particularly feel. All right? Next, you want to consider the cultural context. Reaction to persuasive appeals can be influenced by culture's customs and values. And we've kind of I briefly went over this just a minute ago. Be aware of specific considerations, okay? You want to make sure that you recognize that cultures differ. The ways that you are going to come out, even within specific business cultures, they are going to differ a little bit between, say, the United States and Japan. Understand that they are going to differ. You also need to understand the importance of saving face in all cultures. No one, there's always that deep-rooted sense of honor. You want to make sure that you are understanding how that affects that specific culture, and learn all you can about the various business cultures. If you're going to go to, say, Japan, make sure that you do a little studying into what sorts of culture they have. Ask questions with people who've been there. These are all things that are going to help you in the long run to be a better communicator within the technical communication world. And not only that, you may have often times where you're going to have international people from other nations that are going to be coming to work with your company. You may not necessarily be going to Japan so much as Japan is coming to you. And you need to understand that as well, and understand that you need to be able to provide a soft buffer for them to come in, and that they are going to be able to save face. All right. Digital persuasion and social media, you need to make sure that you understand that the internet has positive and negative effects on how people research, receive, and process information. And this has never been more valid than it has been within the past few years, specifically politically. When you have a lot of information, you have a lot of people out there who are Google researchers who believe that they have more knowledge and understanding of a specific thing than, say, a medical doctor who has been in the field for 20 some odd years. On the plus side, more people have access to vast amounts of information. We are living in this veritable Alexandria library. We are living in this information age where anything can be discovered at the touch of a few buttons, and it allows people to consider many points of view. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to consider many points of view. They may only want to lock in their specific point of view. On the negative side, social media also caters to individual likes and dislikes. Thereby, it's going to isolate people from viewpoints that are going to be in conflict with their own. When people go in and they often research, they may research with terminology that goes and says things like the truth about global warming. And there are several things about adding that into a search engine that is going to bring you biased information when you come and you look at it. Okay, first of all, it's not so much called global warming. It is actually, climate change. Not only that, the truth about. Those tends to bring in points of contestation. And that can be a difficult thing to process. People tend to look for affirmation of their beliefs more so than they do for just specifically learning about that point of view, or even trying to find out what other people may have to think about it. Also, social media creates confirmation bias, which we just talked about. All right, confirmation bias is going to enhance what people already know despite conflicting evidence. Just like we said, when people go out and they start looking for global warming information, people can even be persuaded by false stories. You need to understand that to avoid confirmation bias, make sure that you're reading and considering what you found online with more care. Where did it come from? Who took it? What all went into it? Take the time to check the source. Okay? Check out who this is. Read more slowly and avoid jumping to immediate conclusions. Okay? Often I've been guilty of going through and reading a specific article, reading a paragraph and jumping to a conclusion and thinking about putting that article down at that moment just to go in and start to talk about it a little bit. And then I realized that later on they discuss exactly what my point was it can make you look foolish. Okay? You also want to make sure that you analyze the situation. Okay? You want to assess the political climate. Okay? Now is a very difficult time to talk about things like climate change. It's a difficult time to talk about immunology, about anything in medicine, pretty much. It's a difficult time because the political climate has become conflated with the scientific climate, and it makes it very difficult. Later on in the semester, we will be discussing a little bit more about manufactured scientific controversy and how often science and discovery and the things that we discover can also often be conflated with a political climate in order to stall progress in sciences. You need to make sure that you are learning the unspoken rules when it comes to analyzing the situation, okay? Understand how to navigate specific areas, whether they, when they are definitely going to be politically divided. Now, you need to know the unspoken rules if you are just, say, arguing about climate change. You need to understand the unspoken rules that go along with that, okay? And unspoken rules can be things such as not preaching to the choir and making sure that when you analyze the situation, that you're not speaking condescendingly to an audience that you want to change the minds of, okay? You need to make sure that you approach it very carefully and decide on a connection or a combination of connections. How do you want to connect that material to your reader? And then you need to anticipate your audience's reactions. All of these things combine to help you better understand how you can navigate that situation, okay? And oftentimes people will pick up information if you've been condescending or if you have treated your audience even unknowingly. I'll often say don't use the term dumbing down, because dumbing down is not what science and technical communication is about. We do not dumb things down, okay? It's about making information accessible to non-experts. It's not about dumbing something down. So make sure that you are anticipating your audience's reaction. You also want to make sure that you are going to be thinking about developing a clear and credible plan. Okay, define your precise goal. Make sure that you do your homework. Think your idea through. Never make a claim or ask for something that people will reject outright, and consider the cultural context. Okay? Defining your precise goal, getting straight to the point is what this technical communication is about. You want to make sure that you are doing your homework, you've researched, and you know how to navigate that situation, that you can analyze that situation. Think your idea through, considering the context of audience, considering political context, all the climate that's going around, everything that's going on within the scope that you need to understand that you're going to be presenting in. And never make a claim or ask for something that people are going to reject outright. And they're going to reject it outright for many different reasons. One, it's absurd. Just cannot possibly happen within this lifetime, or it's going to be rejected because you were too forceful. Okay, that you did not consider certain ways of approaching or analyzing the situation, and you were too forceful, or you were too condescending, or you were any of these things can make them reject you outright. And just consider the cultural context. Remember saving face, and remember who you're asking. You also want to make sure that when you present your argument, you want to be clear about what you want. You want to avoid an extreme persona. Okay, don't be overly dramatic. Don't be overly comedic. You want to avoid extreme persona and go with something that's going to be more middle of the ground. Remember that you're going to be writing for a general audience, or even a group of experts. You need to make sure and understand who your audience is going to be, and understand the difference between what professionalism is going to be and non-professionalism. Okay, you don't want to be too casual. You also want to find points of agreement with your audience. So especially if you are going to be offering up evidence and information that is going to be contradictory to what they believe already. You want to make sure that you are trying to find ways to thread the needle for agreement. Okay, people are going to be a little bit more open to understand your position and accept your argument when you've made a couple of concessions. That when you have come in and you have stated that, I understand how this can be seen as this, or so on and so forth. Never distort an opponent's position, and never be flamboyantly, out of pocket with it. Never say that they are saying something that they did not. Try to concede again to the opponent. Give them information that is going to help them accept what you want to say a little bit more. Don't merely just criticize their side. Don't merely criticize their points. Again, everybody has heard of the compliment sandwich, where you say they've done something well, then give them a critique, and then compliment them to kind of go out on it. It works a little bit. It's similar to that in technical communication as well, especially when you're talking about for persuasion. Stick to claims you can support. Do not start speaking about things that you have no support for. Often people digress. I'm one of them. I can often digress to a long spiel. And when we digress, we often digress into ways that we can't, into arguments that we can't necessarily support, right? So you got to stick to your best material. You got to stick with claims that you know, that you have evidence for. Don't go further, okay? When it comes to presenting your argument, you want to make sure that before releasing the document, you seek a second opinion. I cannot stress enough the importance of finding coworkers who have already delved into certain tasks that you're about to delve into. They are going to be perfect to get a second opinion from, a third opinion from, a fourth opinion from. Get people to look at it, okay? And don't go just specifically out to mom and dad and say, hey, mom, dad, can you check this out and see what they're saying? Because The problem with mom and dad, they are looking at these things through rose-colored lenses, and they're going to be so happy with what their baby created. Good job. I knew you can do anything. You can do anything you put your mind to. No, no, no. That's not the way to go. You need to find people that don't necessarily like you all the time. Okay? Sometimes finding people that you barely know, or people that may strictly be a coworker, not a friend, and not even someone that's an acquaintance that you might meet for racquetball once a month. Okay? You need to find somebody that is going to be direct and straight with you. Get the timing right. Again, make sure that when you're timing this, that it's not conflicting with certain political things and things that are going on. Make sure that you understand when this document is going to be released. Decide on the proper format. Okay, how do I want this to format it? Does it need to be on company letterhead? Does it need to be formatted in a very professional, sophisticated way? Or is there a little bit more of a casual nature to it? Never is it going to be acceptable for you to get overly lax in anything that's going to be circulated within the office, especially where you may have pet names or inside jokes and things of that nature. Keep in mind that any of this stuff may be shared outside of the company, whether you like that or not. All right, be sure that everyone involved receives a copy of that information, and invite responses. Invite them to give you kind of feedback on what you could have done better, or any kind of issues that may crop up for them with any of the things that you're asking for. And don't be defensive about negative reactions. Too often we will get negative reactions to something that we've worked on, or that we've read, or that we've written, and that we've passed out to our peers or coworkers or what have you, and we'll get defensive about specific reactions. You have to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about getting a second opinion or a third opinion or a fourth opinion, right? You are not going to necessarily be alongside every single individual that reads or is confronted with this document that you have, okay? You're not always going to be there with someone as they're reading the document to explain why you use that turn of phrase, okay? If someone asks you about it, there's a problem with it, and you might need to seek out ways of making it clearer. And get yourself some thick skin, okay? This isn't about tearing you down and telling you what a terrible communicator or terrible writer you are. No, no, no. This is about making you better, okay? But then when you're giving that feedback, you also need to know, when do you need to back off, okay? When should you abstain from going any further? And typically, it's good to give somebody a little feedback into maybe 1 or 2 issues, maybe 3 issues. I would not go further than that, because then you're going to start to overwhelm someone about what they're doing and what they're reading, and it can often have negative consequences as opposed to more positive consequences, okay? With that said, I'm going to conclude this lecture on persuasion. If you have any further questions, I invite you to leave comments down in the comments section below, or you can email me at the email that my students, you guys have been provided with. Other than that, I look forward to hearing back from you, and I will see you at the next lecture. Thanks.